welcome back to part 6 of our series on self-management of funding arrangements. And this week we're talking about some of those other considerations that don't often get talked about. Because when we talk about self-management of funds, we tend to focus a lot on the tasks, aspects and the functions that need to be done and the things that have to be done now, rather than things that could take place in the future or the things that are a little bit tougher to talk about. So today, Kathy and we're going to be tackling those other considerations that require the resilience part of managing a self-managed arrangement. So, Kathy, going into a self-management arrangement is all about going in with eyes wide open. And a lot of that is about not just thinking about the here and now, but the future. Mm-hmm. So I know this is a topic and an area of self-managed funding that's really close to your heart, mm-hmm. and that you had some personal experience with as well. So can you share with us what you think some of those other considerations are that people need to think about now and not just if it ever happens?
Okay. I think this also sits quite nicely with the research I did a few years ago, because I was looking very clearly at sustainability of these arrangements. It's not just something you pick up because you think, oh, this might be the latest thing, or I might be able to, make the money work better or whatever, without actually really thinking it through. For many people, it can be a long-term process. It's a decision you don't take lightly because of the responsibilities involved. Even if you're only responsible for the roster, it's still a responsibility and obligation.
Yeah.
So it's a long-term process. So it's actually realising that it's something that will have its ebbs and flows over the time. To start with, it's a lot of work. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, it doesn't take much to do it all and whatnot. Well, that can happen down the track. But to start with, it does take a bit of thinking, and we've been talking about, the foundation work and thinking about, what the values are, what your vision is, why you're doing it, to recruit new staff or to find other people in the community who'll be there in the unpaid capacity. That all takes time.
Yeah.
So to start with, it does take time,
yeah.
And it does take, you need to be aware that with the best of intentions, things don't always take great.
So sometimes things can go wrong.
Sometimes, wrong. It's not necessarily
not the best
wrong.
Choice of words, no.
Not necessarily wrong.
Right.
It's just realising that there are fluctuations in it. Okay.
Yeah. Ebbs and flows.
Yeah. Like a key person on your team might leave suddenly, or a family member could pass away, or there could be some other unforeseen disaster that occurs, and it can be a disaster. Losing a key person on a team can be a disaster. It can really throw you around, and it's realising that it will be messy when those times happen. You can plan for it as best you can, but that plans can work really well, but sometimes the best laid plans can go out the window because it doesn't always flow that way.
Yeah, that's right. So some of those key things, if we're going to talk specifics about what are some of those things we should be thinking about, succession planning. So it's a long-term thing. You've talked about how for some people doing the self-management is a long-term commitment. And often there's a key driver. You've talked a lot in the last blogs about creating a team approach, having your allies and champions with you, but usually there's one key driver. Quite often, if it's on behalf of a person with a disability, it's often a parent, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be a parent, it can be a sibling, it could be another person altogether. It might be a spouse, or a friend. It's someone with a commitment there to take on that responsibility for managing whatever. And I think when you're talking about succession, we often use like a backup plan, your fallback position. If everything goes wrong, what are you going to do? Who's going to be there? There's certainly been a number of workshops over recent years around establishing your will, and making sure that you've covered your bases in the will. And there are solicitors and lawyers out there who will do that.
So that's quite a when you're talking about a will and self-management funding arrangements, that's not something everybody thinks about when doing a will. So succession planning and including those arrangements and talking about that in planning your will becomes a consideration?
It does, absolutely. I think for myself, I had to think about who were going to be the administrators of my will, for example. So, for example, if I pass away before my daughter, I believe she has the right to a continued life, and seriously, she'd just expect that her life would continue on, like, oh, blip, mum's died, well, big whoop,
I'm still here and I want to have a good life and quality.
That's right. Yeah. So it's about thinking about, in the event that that does happen, and the reality is the research says that people with disabilities can expect to live an ordinary lifespan, and an ordinary lifespan may be outliving the parent. So you have to be thinking, okay, if that happens and I'm on my own, so for me I had to think about, well, okay, who was going to step into the void to at least give some thinking space while things sort of settle down. So the structure means that, the support will continue on, the staff will continue to be paid, the staff will continue to be there, and while we work out, or while I can't come back from beyond the grave and haunt people, but I've tried. But it's about thinking about that, and making sure that wherever the person's living is sustainable, and that's not going to be tampered with. So yes, it does take a bit of courage. I mean, people like to think they're going to outlive the person with the disability, but that's not always the case. So it's about that. It's also engaging, whoever those people are who will continue the journey onwards beyond your life, for example, actually understand why that's important.
So having that discussion, having that idea and discussion in your own will planning goes beyond just you having that with that will,
vision.
It's about who you talk to about the succession plan for who's to take over. It's a tough one, because most people find talking about doing a will and all that sort of stuff, that's a tough one anyway. So, but you're saying it's something to think about. It's one of those other considerations. It's a tough one to talk about, but if you want things to go on, then it's a conversation to be had.
I really think it's a mandatory conversation. I don't know what other services do around that, but it's a conversation that we need to have with people who want to self-manage, because at the end of the day, if the family or the person with a disability themselves haven't thought about, if they cannot manage any aspect of the self-managed arrangement for a range of reasons, and for a person with a disability that could be that they're hospitalised or they become unwell, or there's some other crisis that occurs in their life, how do their staff continue to be paid, and how do they maintain their house or whatnot? So it's an issue for people.
And it's an issue too, I guess, if you've got an idea of who it is you think would be an appropriate person to take that on, and you talk to them and it actually doesn't figure in their life plan or their vision for themselves, so then you've actually got to then rethink that. So it's a good, it's about thinking about it, isn't it?
And I guess at the present time, I've thought about, and that certainly the three people that I have pegged in my will, like to take on that role, they're my age, and I've realised, gosh, now I have to think about a younger generation, because say for example if one of the administrators passes away, it doesn't automatically follow that this is part of their will,
that's right.
And I need to be really careful about who's there to maintain the vision and the focus and the
how far do you succession plan?
I know. But it's part and parcel. You have to think, if something happened to us as the key person responsible, how does this all keep going?
Because it could just be illness.
Of course.
And unforeseen illness for a short period of time.
Or, like I've sometimes said to my team, this could be a case of me acquiring early onset dementia. We don't go there with my family who think I already have it. But, like the randomly weird decisions that I might make that don't actually make sense and don't actually, from their knowledge of the arrangement and how things work for my daughter, they might be going, that just doesn't seem right. So who are they going to be able to talk to in the event that I start doing something that's just bizarre,
doesn't fit.
Or if I have a stroke or something, So I've had to think about that.
Yeah.
So the team are aware of who they can talk to.
Yeah.
That's apart from me.
Yeah.
Because they need to know that they can talk to somebody who's got the best interests of the team at heart,
Yeah.
and what we're there to do at heart.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big one. What about some other unforeseens and other considerations? So I know that in the work that I do, families get very, having a support worker or someone work with your son or daughter with a disability, you develop such a close rapport and relationship, and support workers don't always stay for the long haul, and sometimes that can be quite a curveball. So what's your advice around managing those kinds of changes and being resilient around that?
Well, I think it's about being aware that those things will happen. In that research I did a few years ago, one of the ladies I interviewed had been self-managing her daughter's arrangement for, I think it was over about 25 years. I think it was a long time. And she had a key connection with her key worker, okay, and the key worker for her was it. So she was very dependent, and there was a huge amount of trust involved in that relationship. But the reality is that people who are working there or supporting, it's a bit like the connections we have with other people in the community, and the informal friendships and relationships for people with disability. They come and go. For the best of reasons, and sometimes it's not always convenient, but that sounds selfish. I mean, people have got the right to move on and do other things in life. It can be because the work no longer suits them, or their partner wants to move,
Different
or
life stage.
Anything of that can happen. It can be ill health and whatnot like that. I think it's about acknowledging that this could happen, and to make the best of the relationship while they're there. It can be messy when your roster's dependent upon that person and they don't give any notice, or they just they don't turn up for work and whatnot.
So how do you manage that?
It can be very difficult. Sometimes that means you're put back on the spot again, and that can have a bearing on your life. Sometimes it means that other people have to step in to the void while you're trying to recruit quite quickly, and trying to find the right person again. If you don't have a lot of people in your team or whatever, it can be quite challenging. It's not impossible.
No, but I guess it's saying this is where you need to have resilience, and part of resilience is going, change happens, and sometimes it's not convenient, and sometimes it means it's going to be tough for a short while, but again, you want to focus on the long-term outcome, and you don't want to be recruiting just anybody. You want to take the time to recruit appropriately, so in that meantime having that backup plan.
And I think it's the connections perhaps with another local service, or someone that you can trust who might step in even on a casual basis for the interim.
So having some arrangements around that.
That's right.
What about self-care? So managing an arrangement, it takes energy and personal investment. How do you look after yourself as the key person in managing the arrangement? And how important is self-care in that regard?
I think self-care is critical. It took me a long time to realise that if I wasn't looking after myself and actually having my own life in it, that I really wouldn't be doing the best that I could, or I think I'm doing the best that I can, but it's not just about giving out and being exhausted and emotionally frazzled and whatnot. That doesn't work for anyone. I think the person who's responsible for the arrangement needs to have time out. Time out can mean anything, to be honest. I guess self-care for myself is also about reading and examining other things and other ways to be better at what I do. But self-care can be anything that gives you relaxation and just time out.
Or it gives you energy.
That's right. Because to manage these things over time, you're really relying on resilience, your own resilience, and your own ability to have fortitude to withstand the hits and the buffets that occur, even from when things are working really well. Sometimes it just can be the toll of dealing with
The day-to-day,
and
yeah.
just the fatigue levels and whatnot. Like, you can be very tired doing this,
Yeah.
and continually trying to keep an even keel on it and a happy face on it, when really it's hard. It can be hard.
Yeah.
But it can be incredibly
Joyful as well.
joyful. Yeah. And a lot of great benefits can happen
Huge
from this.
benefits.
Yeah.
So it is about recognising that you're doing the best for the person with the disability when you do look after yourself as well. Excellent. And I think the last thing I wanted to ask about was staying ahead of or abreast of information. So things are changing all the time in the sector, and things are changing when it comes to the governance and, you know, around self-management of funds. How important is it for people to stay ahead of and informed on those things?
I think that it's really, really important, and there's information that's provided in a number of different ways around those. Probably one of the most important aspects is realising that, yes, we might be in a self-managed arrangement, but we're influenced and we have to abide by legislation, for example. So there's whole heaps of things that impact on us, whether it's Fair Work, whether it's Work Health and Safety, Privacy Act. You know, there's lots of legislation out there that we need. We have to realise that they're a reality in our life, right?
Yeah.
We can't assume that we're separate from that, because we're not.
No.
If we're employing staff, or we have employed staff in our home, there are obligations around that.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's also about realizing that for people with disabilities, you know, the world's moving on, and it's just there's so many optimistic avenues and possibilities for people, and that's what we want.
So keeping up with those trends as well is also very important.
And, you know, realizing that for us as parents, or, you know, the significant other people in there, you know, we also need to be nourished by that as well, by information. And there are often other things that we never even thought about. It might be, you know, we might be at a conference, or, you know, a meeting, and somebody says something that opens up a doorway for you to go and explore something else that you would never have thought about. I think it's about being willing and open to go and search.
And expose yourself to where you're going to get that information from. Definitely. I think legislation's always hard to keep on top of because it changes so quickly, but there are ways you can subscribe to get legislative updates. So that's a fantastic thing. So I'd recommend people subscribe to get that information.
I think we can say that because we're service providers. But parents and people with disabilities probably won't be remotely interested in it.
No.
But I think it's more just being aware that those things are out there, and
asking people.
And don't think you're separate from it.
No.
Because we're not.
No. Thank you, Kathy. Well, that's a big one. So basically, and in review, what I'm hearing you say from your experience is that there's a lot of day-to-day to-dos. So let's focus on those, but let's not forget those harder conversations and those other considerations that we don't always think of or are really hard to face at times. Succession planning, dealing with the unknown, staying ahead of information, and looking after yourself.
That's right.
They all factor.
They do.
Excellent. Well, I hope after this that you're going to go and get some self-care, a good book, a bottle of white.
Or something.
Thanks, Kathy. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye. Figuring this stuff out can be a bit overwhelming, and that's why Kathy and I have developed a little guide and an ebook to help families and people with disabilities navigate their way through this and figure out what kind of self-management fund option might be best for you. So I'm going to include the link to the ebook in the description box below. So go ahead, and it's free, download that and get started.